All right, welcome everyone. It is 5:30 and I will call this policy meeting to order. Ms. Shope, may we please have a roll call?
Anderson Spencer,
Present.
Amy Levy,
Here.
Greg Schneider.
Present.
All members of the committee are present. Two are virtual, Spencer Anderson and Greg Schneider.
Perfect, thank you so much. Is there a motion to approve the agenda for this evening?
So moved.
All right, I will provide a second. There is a motion and a second to approve the agenda. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All right, that motion passes unanimously. Thank you. Next up are our minutes from the May 4th meeting. Before I entertain a motion to approve, are there any adjustments from any committee members? All right, the only one I have, Ms. Shope, it says that I asked Board Clerk Schneider to be the vice chair, but could we also include that he accepted? Perfect, thank you so much. Is there a motion to approve the minutes from the May 4th policy meeting with that adjustment?
So moved. Second.
Perfect, I have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye. Aye.
All right, that motion passes unanimously. That brings us to two, A, B, and C are holdovers from our May meeting. So we will begin. Attorney Bernan, thank you for being with us and welcome. We'll start with the legal updates. Just to remind everyone, we held those three policies together because there were concerns with any non-compete issues, specifically related to the food trucks, and any school versus community needs versus personal gain with respect to rentals. And that could apply to the food trucks, but mainly for facilities. So Attorney Bernan, if you could give us an update on those two issues, and then if you could point out in policy where those updates are impacted, that would be perfect.
Thank you. So in general, I don't know that there is a lot of impact to the policy. I think we had talked about whether there was a way to restrict the competition issues specifically with related to the food trucks. In regard to the district's food truck versus community food trucks, I think the district can certainly limit other food trucks coming onto its property, but I don't believe there is necessarily a way that the district is going to be able to formally restrict food trucks that may appear on property adjacent to the districts. I think the specific events or perhaps in policy may be able to communicate that the district's food truck is sanctioned at a particular event and any other food trucks are not. However, I think that's probably as far as you're going to be able to go because you don't have any sort of legal jurisdiction off of district property. So I believe that was the first issue that we had discussed. I would allow time if anybody has questions or wants to comment on that.
I just have one question. If you need to get back to us, that's completely fine. But what in general is the kind of radius of school property? So it's the physical building and then how many feet or however that is measured away from that building, the area around that is considered district property. For example, if a food truck was parked on the street in front of one of our schools, if we had, let's say, a carnival or some other event, if I'm understanding you correctly, we couldn't prohibit another food truck from parking on that same street right next to our truck unless that is considered school grounds. So if you could give us information of what is deemed school grounds, that would be helpful for me.
Board Member Levy, I think that's correct. I think as to what is technically school property, I would defer to district administration as to the boundaries of actual property. But yes, in the sense that you're referring to a public thoroughfare being a street, that's going to be public property. To the extent that the city may regulate licensure of what food trucks can do on certain street corners or where they can be parked, there might be some regulation by the city of that. I was not able to find anything readily available, but the district could confer with the city to understand what regulations would be placed and if there's any support from the city available in that regard. In most cases, I would think that the district is parking its own food truck on district property. I don't know if that's an incorrect assumption, if administration has any comment to that effect. But if both food trucks are parked on public city property, I do not believe there would be a distinction between the two. Does that answer your question?
No, it does. Thank you so much. Do any committee members or non-committee members have any questions at this time for Attorney Baran?
I do not.
All right, sounds good. So we will do what we usually do. We'll look at policy 830, 830 Rule 1, and 830 Rule 2 as a block before I entertain any motions to approve, but we'll take it one page at a time. So we'll start with policy 830. And actually, since this is, I believe, our third time reviewing these, I'm going to take it one policy at a time rather than one page. So Vice Chair Schneider, I will start with you. Do you have any corrections or edits for policy 830 that have not already been covered?
I do not.
Thank you so much. Board Member Anderson, same question. Any edits for policy 830?
I do not.
Okay, thank you so much. I don't as well. If we'll move to policy 830 Rule 1. Vice Chair Schneider, anything on that policy, 830 Rule 1?
I do not.
Okay. Board Member Anderson, same question.
I do not.
Okay, thank you so much, gentlemen. If we could draw our attention to policy 830 Rule 1, page 2, right there after B, and then 1, all of that is stricken through, so it is scheduled for omission. And then we begin with 2, rental basis. Since everything in 1 is proposed to be omitted, Ms. Shope, could you change that 2 to number 1, please?
Yes, it's automatic numbering, so it will do that when
Got it.
we finalize it.
Okay, no problem. And then also on that same page, if we'll look to the top, I don't recall if this was there before, or Ms. Shope, if you added this, but I like it, with the spacing between the numbers. On page 3, that's carried throughout. Could we also include that under special provisions for pool, just the spacing between those numbers? I think it'll make it easier for the public to read.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Those are all of my edits for 830 Rule 1. So that brings us to policy 830 Rule 2. Vice Chair Schneider, any edits on anything in that Rule 2 of policy 830? Thank you for projecting that.
I do not.
Okay. Board Member Anderson, same question.
I do not.
All right. My question is for the second page of that policy, the very last sentence under catering. It lists food service management company, FSMC, and I believe right now that is Aramark, correct?
Correct.
Right. Is there a reason we didn't put Aramark, so if anyone from the public is reading that, they would know that, or was the rationale to keep it more general in case we ever are not using Aramark, we wouldn't have to go back and make that change?
The latter, so that we had the generality in case we switch vendors at some point in the future.
Okay, perfect. And then my other question actually pertains to the next page with the cross references. The community use fee schedule, could we put that as a cross-reference? Because I think that's going to be important when people are looking at fees associated with rentals.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. So that.
Board Member Levy?
Yes,
Board Member
go right
Levy?
ahead.
If you're trying to keep the Aramark references more general, I would just note that you have the same issue at 2A on page 2.
Thank you so much. Dr. Kieser, what is your preference? Is it to go with FSMC and wherever we use that first, we'll spell it out, or is it to use error mark, just as long as we're consistent? Thank you, Attorney Baran.
And
Thank-
1A as well, actually.
Yeah, thank you. I would say using the food service management company to keep it general.
Perfect. So Ms. Shope, will you go through and make those edits for us?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. All right, is there a motion to approve policies 830, 830 Rules 1 and Rules 2 with the edits discussed?
So moved.
Second?
All right, there is a motion and a second on the floor. Is there any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor to move policies 830, 830 Rule 1, and 830 Rule 2 to the full board for first reading, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All right, that motion passes unanimously. Thank you, everyone. That brings us to 2D, which is policy 831. Tobacco and electronic delivery device use on school premises. I have a question before I yield the floor to other committee members. In reviewing policy, I see that 831 is currently listed under retired policy with a slightly different name. So policy 831, tobacco use on school premises, is retired. So I'm wondering, is there a reason why that policy was retired instead of adding it, instead of having another policy with the same number that we are now revising?
With the same number in 831?
Yeah, if you look under policies and then go under retired, it has 831 tobacco use on school premises. And the policy that we're revising this evening is also 831, but has a slightly different name, tobacco and electronic delivery device use on school premises.
It might, the only thing I can see, let's see, last reviewed, 1990. 894. Only thing I can see is that there was some additional language that was added, and so they must have retired the old version of it, and this is the newest, the most up-to-date current version. So that's a previous revision, an older revision under the retired.
So Attorney Baran, maybe you can provide some clarity, but my thinking, just to keep things simple, for me, it doesn't make sense to have policy 831 be active under one name and also be retired under another name. So do we need to disregard this current policy that we are revising, or what is your recommendation for how we marry those two entities?
Can I jump in real quick?
Oh, you're muted. Hold on one second. We'll hear from Attorney Baran, and then I'll come right back to you.
Well, I was just going to ask you to direct me to where it shows retired.
Okay, you may not be able to view it. I am in Board Docs, and under the Policies tab, there's like a little caret. And if we click on that, you can view policies that are active, draft, or retired. And if you click on retired, there's only, in the 800 series, like 6. And the last one is 831, tobacco use on school premises.
Okay, so I may not be able to see that. I will, if Dr. Kieser was jumping in, I'll let him speak, and then if needed, I can comment as well.
Thank you, Dr. Kieser.
So the title change is tobacco and electronic delivery. So this version of 831, the title change and the additional language is in regards to the vaping and that. And so that in the retired version, it was just tobacco use on premises. So this one has the additional language around electronic delivery devices or the vaping devices.
No, I understand that distinction, but my question, and then I'm coming right to you, Ms. Shope, is we shouldn't retire it and then create a new one. We should just revise the one we had, unless there's something I'm missing. Ms. Shope?
Sorry. So with the board docs program, whenever we revise a policy, once the board has fully approved all of the revisions, so after it goes through committee, then goes to the full board for first reading, then to the full board for second reading, we retire what was the current policy, and it goes into the retired policies, and then the newly revised policy becomes the active policy. Therefore, we have a trail and a history of what the policy formerly looked like.
Thank
So-
you. That was helpful. So let me ask you this. So
Yes.
let's say we have reviewed 100 policies this past school year.
Yes,
All 100 of those policies are going to show up in retired.
correct, under their appropriate series.
Okay.
So as the board approves them, we are retiring them so that we have a captured picture of what they look like. And if you look at the 831 tobacco use on school premises, you can see that that one was retired on November 26th of 2019, which should correspond with the last revised date of the current one, if we're doing things appropriately. And so if you look at the 831 that's up for revision right now, it says last revised November 26, 2019. So that corresponds with the retired date of the one that's in the retired policies. So like Dr. Keyser said, the name change to include electronic devices and the extra verbiage was a revision made through the board process in 2019 and finalized on November 26, 2019.
Perfect. Let me ask you this. If next year, which I don't envision this happening, policy 183 is revised again and goes through the full board for approval, we will have one updated 831 and we will have two retired 831s.
That's my understanding because they'll have different retired dates. I can't promise you that because we haven't retired enough policies yet for me to see that happen.
Okay.
But that's my understanding because they'll have different retired dates that we should see both of those retired versions so we have a way to track the changes that have been made over time.
Perfect.
In the past, I tracked all of that on my computer.
That sounds like a good time. Question, somewhere there lives a key that talks about what revision means, what retired means, what all of that. Is the explanation that you just provided for me that was super helpful, does that live alongside that key?
I would have to double check the key, which is on our featured page.
Okay.
Of board docs, and it's also in the library. But in the library, I've told it to feature it, so then it appears on the featured page to help people who are looking at policies. But I can double check that, because I'm not sure. I can also double check by logging in as a quote-unquote public person on the public side
Right.
to see how much they can see on the retired side. Not sure they can see all the retired policies. I think that's more for us in-house to be able to see what our policies used to say. But I can double check that.
Perfect. And if it's not there, please add it, even if the general public can't see the retired policies, because for board members, I think that's really good information. Until this moment, I was not aware of that was the process of retiring the policy. So
Yes.
thank you for providing that context. And if it's not there with the key, please do go ahead and add that. So my only question on policy, well, let me yield the floor. Vice Chair Schneider, do you have any additions or questions with policy 831? All right, he may have stepped away. Board Member Anderson, same question.
I do not.
Okay. My only question is the cross references. There is a note to remove policy 831 rule 1, which we'll be looking at next. And so my question is there a reason that note to remove that is there?
That's the only revision for this policy is that 831 Rule 1 no longer exists, but it was still listed as a cross-reference to this policy. So that's the rationale for bringing it forward today.
Okay, with 831 Rule 1, the cessation clinics, has that information been transferred somewhere else, or what is the reason why that rule was removed?
To my knowledge, it was an oversight when the policy was last revised. It should have been removed back then, but I don't have any information as to when that rule was eliminated. Actually, I think we might have just answered with our previous conversation. I'll go to retired and see when it was retired.
Yeah, it's not listed there.
It's not.
Nope.
So that would be information. I do not have information as to when this was retired. I just know that it was not removed at the time that rule was eliminated.
So while we're talking about nomenclature, and Ms. Shope, this question is for you. Under what you just described, unless I'm missing something, there would never be a reason to remove a policy or a rule of a policy. If it's no longer active or in use, it would be retired. Is that accurate?
That's correct. Now, with board docs, which is the beauty of board docs,
Okay.
everything gets retired. In the past, I tracked everything on my computer, and at one point when policies were deleted, they were like deleted, blown away, gone. So I could find sometimes either in board packets on my computer, or if I kept the revisions, I could find the policy that way. But in my list of policies, it was deleted. Then I decided at one point to create a new folder that said deleted policies, and I started keeping them in case somebody ever said, hey, didn't we have a policy on such and such? And I could go, if I couldn't find one in active policies, I could go into deleted policies and say, yes, we did, but it was deleted. And then on my log that I keep, I could say, and here's when it was deleted. So that was all the old way of doing things. So Board Docs is much nicer because it keeps it all for us.
So let me ask you this. Under what you just described,
Yes.
you probably have record of policy 831 Rule 1. Is that accurate?
I should have, yes.
Okay. In making the best use of board docs and the way we used to do things, which it sounds like was a lot of tracking on your end, what is the best practice for bringing a policy back and retiring it so we have it in board docs, and then we would change that remove to retired as the cross-reference?
I would say that you could still, remove this cross-reference because the policy is no longer in existence. But if you're wanting to take old policies that no longer exist and put them into our retired policies, that's probably a process that could be done over time.
Okay, so let's do this. I want to check in with the rest of the committee members. My preference is to bring back the deleted policies and retire them in board docs, so there is a record of this is what the policy was, and it's not lost. But I would love to hear from both of you, Vice Chair Schneider and then Board Member Anderson, please.
I think it would be a great idea to keep a record of that in board docs.
So let me tack on a part B of that question. Are you comfortable with moving policy 831 forward before that happens, or would you like for that to happen at the same time? Do you have a preference?
Feel comfortable moving forward and having that happen. at the same time or shortly after.
Okay, thank you. Board Member Anderson?
I mean, I'm always in favor of keeping more records because, I mean, that's an easy way for us to look back and see how things have changed in the past.
Okay.
But just like as a caveat, just as workload permits, because the way I interpreted how Michelle was talking about it is that no matter what, like it says remove 831 Rule 1. Well, it's going to get removed because it's not a policy anymore. So we can have it end up in as a retired policy. So, I mean, as long as, again, workload permits where she can actually do that.
All right, thank you so much, Board Member Anderson. Dr. Kieser, I would love your feedback. Does it seem reasonable for you and Ms. Shope to come up with a plan for how we will bring all deleted policy back and retire them in board doc? But we start by doing that on a case-by-case basis. So for example, if we could begin with bringing back policy 831 Rule 1 and retiring it so it's in the system of board docs, and then we can change that note under cross-reference from remove to retired.
I think if you're okay with us working with board docs to see if we could do a mass upload into retired and then provide the policy committee with a list of all of the policies that have been uploaded into the retired, I think that would probably be the most efficient use in trying to get all of this. And then the remove was just the notation to remove that cross-reference. But to your point, we could bring back and say, here are all the policies, including 831 Rule 1, that have been uploaded into the retired section of board docs. Because I know when we transitioned here, they provided us a free upload of all of our policies, active policies, into their system. So I'm hopeful that for maybe a nominal cost, we can do a mass upload.
Perfect, that would be great. And for this specific policy, isn't a reasonable ask, Ms. Shope, for you to pull policy 183 Rule 1 and retire it, that specific one, and then have the note on policy 831 to say pending retirement instead of remove, and then once you do that, switch it to retired?
So you're asking to keep a cross-reference to a retired policy?
Well, one, we have to retire it. And then two, change the note from remove to retired. And then, so that's step 1 and 2. And then step 3 would do what Dr. Kieser recommend, would have a mass upload of all of our deleted policies and retire them. And then that way, no further action would be needed until we come across a policy and it says remove and we just switch it to retired, because we can always search it under retired policy.
Okay, so either I'm confused or I feel there's some confusion in some of the terminology.
Okay.
So a retired policy is the same thing as a deleted policy. It's like synonymous because the policy basically no longer exists. It's been deleted or retired.
May I interject?
Yeah.
So for me, the difference is deleted policies don't reside in board docs, and retired policies do. So once you do the mass upload that Dr. Kieser suggested, which I think is a great idea, those deleted policies are going to be converted to retired policies. So there is a difference.
Okay.
Board Member Levy?
Yes.
If I can just raise a question.
Sure.
There was a comment as to whether the retired policies are publicly accessible. And because I am accessing board docs as a member of the public, I could be missing it, but I'm not sure that the public has access to the retired policies, in which case it would seem to be confusing perhaps to leave the cross-reference on the active policies for members of the public who can't find those policies. But maybe that's my clarification needed.
No, I appreciate that, but I think it is important for future board members that will review policy. So maybe if we go back to that key, just put a note there, like retired cross-referenced policies are notated on policy but are not visible to the public, but they're critically important for board members who review policy. So yeah, I thank you for pointing that out. I think we can clear that up with a note in the key. Ms. Shope, did we clean up all of the confusion, or do you still have questions?
I think so. I think I understand
Okay.
now.
And if you were
what you're
confused,
trying to
others might be as well. So let me, in summary, I would like for you to upload policy 180 or 831, Rule 1,
Yep,
and put it as retired.
okay,
And then change the cross-reference on policy 831 from removed to retired.
Okay.
And then at some later date, which works for your schedule, to work with Dr. Kieser to get that mass upload of all deleted policies and shift them to retired in board docs.
okay.
Perfect. All right. That was a lot. Board members, do we want to, are we okay with approving 831 with that plan in place for the cross-reference?
I am comfortable with that.
Okay. Board member Anderson.
I am also comfortable with that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Is there a motion to approve policy 831, tobacco and electronic delivery device use on school premises, to move that onto the full board for a first reading?
So moved.
Second?
All right, there's a motion and a second on the floor. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All right, thank you. That policy, that motion passes unanimously. That brings us to policy 840, public gifts to the school. Board Member Schneider, it's a one-pager. Any edits or questions on policy 840?
The only question I have is in paragraph 4, the second line, it says, segregated funds to be used at the discretion of the school unless otherwise specified in the bequest. But under Rule 1, it says that all gifts are given to the district as a whole and not to a particular school. So there's a conflict between the rule and Rule 1.
Okay, thank you. And we'll kind of receive all comments and then talk through it. Board Member Anderson, any edits for page 840?
No, Board Member Schneider got it. The one question I had is, what prompted the change in price for the gift amount?
It's funny that you say that because my note literally says, are we overwhelmed with gifts of $1,000 to $4,999 and we need to raise the minimum? Dr. Kieser, please jump in.
We are not. It is in part just the size of our district and the amount of our operating budget that has increased. We are not at a point where we're overwhelmed with gifts of $1,000 or more. It just is the level of bringing it to the board as a formal agenda item versus making it a notation within like a weekly board update or something like that.
Okay, so I'm actually in favor of keeping it at the 1,000 level, and I'd like to hear back from other board members before we edit it. Because if someone is going to give the district a gift, I think a $1,000 gift, a $4,000 gift is substantial enough to have that publicly acknowledged. And if we are not currently overwhelmed with those types of gifts, I would like to hear how other board members feel about that amount.
I think it's important to acknowledge all gifts that come in. since it is not a large amount, and we're not getting a large number of them, I'm okay with keeping it at the $1,000 level.
Okay, thank you. Board Member Anderson?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the biggest thing is that I just want to make sure that people who do decide to donate something to our district, that they are getting acknowledged as a thank you, at least, for taking the time and energy to donate that thing to us.
Okay, thank you so much. Vice Chair Schneider, please yell if I don't address the specific point that you raised in my remarks. So my first question is, in that third paragraph, the superintendent shall be informed in writing. So if I am a member of the public who wants to donate a gift to the district, unless I read this policy, how would I know that? So if I come and bring a gift, do you then require that I put something in writing for the gift?
So the superintendent shall be informed in writing is when a potential donor, let's say we had this earlier this year, we had a donor donate some equipment to our special education department. And so when that comes to Ms. Beavers, she gives me in writing, we are being donated this equipment. It has a value of this. So that way we have a written record of that, and then it also triggers this policy to say we're going to acknowledge and thank the individual, but then at what level do we notify the board of that as a formal board item and bring it to a board meeting, or notify the board through some other means?
Okay. So, and my apologies, because I was reading with the policy, rereading this while you were speaking. So, as we currently are staffed now, so Ms. Beavers would put that in writing, or we would ask the person who's giving the gift to put that in writing?
Sometimes it comes in writing from the individual, but it will come to me in a written form. So whether if it's passing a note along with the donation, or if it is a written acknowledgement to me from, say, an executive director or principal or whoever received the actual gift conversation or the gift notice, they will write me something. So it will come to me in a written form regardless.
Perfect. So are you fine with omitting by a potential donor? Because as you just described, it could come from someone else. So that sentence would then read, the superintendent shall be informed in writing of any gift or bequest of money to be donated to the school district.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you so much. So we'll keep the $1,000 level instead of the suggested change to $5,000. We'll remove by potential donor. If we go down to the fourth paragraph, all gifts, grants, and bequests will become school property. And then it says segregated as trust funds. Attorney Barand, could you explain the reason for including that distinction?
That's a simple statutory requirement. So 11827 sub 2 requires that all monies received as gifts or grants shall be placed in the school district treasury, but shall be considered segregated trust funds.
Okay.
So that's a direct reflection of the statute.
Thank you. I'm just writing myself a note here. So all gifts, grants, and bequests will become school property, segregated as trust funds to be used at the discretion of the school unless otherwise specified in the bequest. So I would like to include unless otherwise specified by the donor. If this is a living donor, I think if someone is donating something, they have the right to direct where they would like that used. So by the donor, and then parenthesis S, if there was more than one, or in the bequest. Now, Vice Chair Schneider, you had mentioned that we were in conflict. Could you bring our attention back to the first part of the policy that you referenced?
Okay, it's in 840, the fourth paragraph, the second line, the same one that you were talking about. It says, in the segregated trust funds to be used at the discretion of the school unless otherwise specified in the bequest. But 540 Rule 1 states that all gifts shall be given to the district as a whole and not to a particular school. So we need to rectify that difference between the policy and Rule 1.
And you said that was policy 540?
Correct.
Okay. I'll get to you in just a second. So,
That's 840. Policy 840.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, please?
It is policy 840 and 840 Rule 1.
Okay. So are you comfortable with keeping the language, it will be used at the discretion of the school unless otherwise specified by the donor or in the bequest? Because if we're fine with that language, we can just repeat that throughout the policy and the rule as needed. Does that work for you?
That works.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
So where that might cause issues is I can give some examples. We get a phone call from a donor who says, I want a piano to go to Aldridge. I want it at Aldridge. They put that in writing, but Aldridge doesn't need a piano. Who really needs that piano could be Converse or Gaston. So, and we've had these occurrences, I want these school supplies to go to Maryland. Dr. Kaiser?
Oh.
So I would just say there can be difficulties when they are directed by a donor for a specific school.
I respect that. Thank you for sharing that context. Would an easy fix be, as a former Converse Cougar, if I wanted my piano to go to Converse and I was adamant about that as a donor? If Converse already has a piano and Merrill needs one, can we just take the piano that's at Converse and send it to Merrill until everyone's happy?
Yes, and I would say instead of where I wanted to interject, and I didn't want to cut off Ms. Christopa, was instead it should say that the bequest becomes district property, and it should be at the discretion of the district unless specified. To your point, if the bequest is to Converse and Converse has one, we can do it that way. But to build the consistency, that was an oversight in our read. It should read at the district level and not at the school level.
Perfect. And I think it's completely reasonable to have a conversation with a donor and, the thank you so much for your generosity. Would you be open to, but if that's a deal breaker for them, take the piano for Converse and give the other piano wherever it needs to go. So thank you for providing that context. It's appreciated. Are board members comfortable with those additions, that it's at the discretion of the district? So that's a change from school, unless otherwise specified by the donor, parenthesis S, if it's like a class, gift, et cetera, or in the bequest. All right. Last call for any edits for policy 840 before we move on to 840 Rule 1. Okay, Vice Chair Schneider, you brought up the consistency, and that will be right at the beginning. All gifts shall be given to the district as a whole and not a particular school. So if we can change that to in general, comma, gifts shall be made to the district as a whole, unless otherwise specified by the donor, parentheses S, or in the bequest. Is everyone okay with that change for consistency?
I'm okay with that.
All right. Do we? It's fine. We'll move forward. So Vice Chair Schneider, 840 Rule 1. Anything else besides the change in that first that opening information? Okay, he may have need to step away. Board Member Anderson, I'll come to you. Same question. Any other changes for policy 840, Rule 1?
I don't believe so.
Okay.
Chair Levy,
Yes.
I would like to make one clarification on the change that you made to the beginning of the policy.
Yep.
Am I keeping or deleting and not to be a particular school? Not to a particular school.
So we're using different language. Let me reread. So it'll say, instead of all gifts,
Yep.
in general, gifts shall be given to the district as a whole. And then I think the other part is kind of repetitive and conflicts, because the rest of it will say, unless otherwise specified by the donor, parentheses S, or in the bequest. And then that would be the period at the
Okay,
end.
so I'm deleting and not to a particular school. Got it.
Please. Yep.
Thank you.
No problem. My question with 1B shall be for a fully funded fixed duration unless the board is willing to continue program or continue the program or initiative when the gift or grant fund is exhausted. And so my question is, are we opposed to having temporary programs? So for example, if someone donates $100,000 to fund Project X for 5 years, are we saying that we would not accept that unless the board is willing to pick up responsibility for year 6 moving forward? So in summary, we will not accept gifts to fund temporary initiatives, if I'm reading the way it's worded right now correctly.
You are correct in that it's helping to discern for potential donees. You're donating this, let's say this sum of money for this particular reason, and as we are looking at that, we want to say, okay, we would not do that unless we're willing to do this. What this would force us to do is to bring this to the board and say, we have a potential donor who wants to do this. Our policy says that we would not accept this unless the board is willing to go forward and continue this after the funds are exhausted. But in that discussion, what isn't precluded is the board saying, we're not sure if we want to continue this at this time, but we are fine with accepting it, and then we will make that decision when those funds are exhausted, if that makes sense. It creates the space where the conversation has to be considered at the board level about, do we want to turn this gift down, or do we want to potentially accept this and then make a secondary decision further down the road?
So no, that doesn't make sense.
Okay.
And but that's why we're here. Okay, so let me broaden it out a little bit. So 1B and 1D go together in my mind, and D is kind of a moot point because it's crossed out. So i.e. it's up for omission.
Correct.
Reading this, I would say the board will not accept gifts. For me, the way it's currently phrased, this does not provide an opening for a discussion for the board to decide, like, yeah, we are not going to continue funding that after the gift is exhausted, but we will approve a temporary program. For me, the way it's currently worded, that is not an option. It just says that if the board's not going to continue year 6 and beyond, if we use the example that I provided, then nope, we won't accept it. So I would propose go ahead.
So to be accepted, a gift shall be for a fully funded fixed duration. If we stop right there, it says we can accept it if it is fully funded for a fixed duration. But it further goes on to say, unless the board, what it's doing is saying, I want to fund this position for 5 years. We can accept it because we're saying we're fully funding this for a fixed duration. But it also says that unless the board's willing to continue it, after that 5 years, that position's gone. So it is combining, B is combining what D used to say into one sentence. So it is, we can accept it if it's fully funded and it's a fixed duration. We can't say, I'm going to give you $1,000 to fund 5 teaching positions. We can't do that because it's not fully funded and it's an unlimited duration. I'm gonna put aside $500,000 for these 5 teaching positions for the next 5 years. Okay, we have to discern if we can accept that for that duration. But then we are going to be bringing it to the board and saying, board, we've got this. Do you want to continue it past that? The board has an opportunity at that time to make a decision or to say, we want to revisit that when that fixed time is up. So maybe we need to add some more words to it, but that's the intent of that line. It's not to exclude it, it's to say, you can't just give us a partially funded donation for an unlimited time. It has to be fully funded and fixed. To be
Perfect.
accepted.
Attorney Barand, I see that your hand was raised. Did you have something to add?
Board Member Levy, that's essentially what I was going to say. That was the same clarification. If they specify, as in your example, that it's for 5 years, the unless wouldn't apply. It would be in the case that they say, I want to fund a literacy program without any finite end to it. And then we may not initiate that literacy program without the board approval that they're supporting continuing it.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that additional context. If we move down to 1E, I'm not clear why not bring was stricken and avoid was inserted. So right now it reads avoid undesirable or hidden costs to the district. I can't think of a scenario where I would be okay with the undesirable or hidden cost to the district associated with a gift or donation. Is there a reason for that change?
Avoid, not bring assumes a certainty to that. Avoid, there might be some circumstances that we thought through every possible scenario, but we just didn't anticipate this one particular piece. So avoid is a more reasonable word to be used in there because we can think through a lot of possible hidden costs or undesirable costs to a donation, but we might not capture everything. And so we wanted to make sure that we were being realistic in how we frame the policy, because one might say, well, you didn't anticipate this one undesirable or hidden cost, and therefore you're now violating policy because of that.
Appreciate that. So I have a question, which Attorney Barand, maybe you can answer, and then I'll get to you because I see your hand raised. What is an undesirable cost that is separate from a hidden cost?
I don't have any specific legal definition to that. I believe that's intended to be read as plain language. I was going to comment on your previous question that these revisions were in part Susan Love revisions, and some of these initial statements were changed to move these towards affirmative statements instead of negative statements, because you start with the affirmative in A, B, and C, and then you switch to not bring, not be, not imply. And so we were trying to bring those into conformity so that they would all read in a similar manner.
That makes sense. Do any committee members have any issue with changing 1E to avoid hidden costs to the district? Is there any particular motivation to keep undesirable cost? Board Member Anderson?
I mean, I have no problem with that. I mean,
Perfect, thank you.
like, it's plain language. Yes.
Okay, so we'll shift E to, and thank you, Attorney Barand, for providing that context about the affirmative language. That makes sense. So 1E will read, avoid hidden costs to the district. And then F, place no restrictions on the school program. I would be in favor of omitting F because we cleared up basically it's the district can decide where gifts, donations, bequests go unless it's specified by the donor. Is there a reason to keep place no restrictions on the school program that I'm missing? Was the spirit behind that, like, I'm going to donate to your after-school program, and because I'm making this donation, you will now include this in your programming? Was that the spirit behind it?
It does have that piece in there, so that even though the bequest might say we want this and you must include this, we could say that's an unreasonable expectation.
Okay, then perfect. That makes perfect sense to me then with F. With H, have no actual or implied endorsement of any business or product. Should that be and rolling into I, conform to all provisions of policy, school code, and I would change that to and public law. We don't want them to pick if it complies with school code but not public law, which we wouldn't have a code that was in conflict with the law. But again, H, if we can shift that to read, have no actual or implied endorsement of any business or product, and rolling into I, conform to all provisions of policy, school code, and public law. All right, that brings us to 2, all plans to donate gifts of equipment. I'm wondering why equipment is specified. I would prefer that it read all plans to donate gifts, which will incur an expense to the district, must be vetted through the business office, unless there's something I'm missing. Is there a reason equipment is there?
I think we can make it more general and say all gifts.
Okay, perfect. And then a couple questions on 3. About halfway through that number, it says primary or secondary level physical education chair. I have no idea what that is.
So many times we will get equipment for PE, like someone donates, I'll just say, a trampoline or something like that for PE class. So if applicable, we would work with people in physical education to say, is this something we would use? Is this in good condition? Things
Is that
like
the department chair?
It can be a department chair. Sometimes we have one person across all the elementaries, and then one person that is designated for intermediate and high school.
But is it a department chair that you're referring to?
We might not call them department chairs, but yes, a department chair person.
Okay. Can we say department chair or equivalent? Would that be acceptable?
Yes.
All right. And then assistant superintendent of instruction was removed, but or designee if applicable. I'm assuming that was just an oversight and that needs to be omitted as well. Is that correct?
So executive director of teaching, learning, and equity. So that or designee.
Okay. So that goes with that one.
Yep.
Okay. And then my other question, I know the superintendent has the flexibility to assign other members to the committee. How does the committee member feel? Because it looks like we have about 6 standing members that need to be on that committee, with also placing a community member on that committee as well, so that would be guaranteed. Because just to bring us back to 3, it's for any gift, donation, or bequeaths that will result in permanent fixtures or attachments to any school building or grounds. Do we believe that there is value in making sure that there is at least one community member on such a committee? Board Member Anderson, I will yield the floor to you. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I'm always in favor of having committee or community members involved in these types of things, but we also have to take into account that maybe there probably won't be a community member that would necessarily want to be involved in certain things. So, I mean, I would rather have it kind of open, having a spot available for a committee or a community member, but not saying there has to be one. So have like a hold time where it's like, hey, like put out a request for a community member to join, but after that time has passed, then it allows them to continue if there was no interest in it.
Okay, thank you for that feedback. So if we worded it with Executive Director of Pupil Services, if applicable, and any other individual assigned by the superintendent, and then new sentence, an offer will be extended to the community to have a community member serve on this committee. And Attorney Brand, if you want to massage that language, I welcome that. So that maintains the superintendent's flexibility to add to the roster, but I think it is important to be intentional about extending an invitation to a community member. Okay, so let's do this. Extending the invitation to community members for at least one spot on that committee. Dr. Kieser, what are your thoughts on that?
No, I think that's appropriate.
Okay. Ms. Shope, do you need me to repeat anything?
Yes, please.
All right. Thank you for attending. We had some students who are heading out. So after Executive Director of Pupil Services, if applicable, and any other individual assigned by the superintendent, the next sentence will read, an invitation will be made to community members to fill at least one spot on this committee. And then that way the invitation will be extended, but the committee can move forward if, like Board Member Anderson suggested, if for some reason there isn't public interest in serving on the committee. Is there anything that I'm missing, Attorney Brand?
My only question is there a limit on how many community members you would want to join? The way that sounds, could be multiple. Is that your intent?
I would say at least one, and then we kind of leave that to the judgment as superintendent. But I would like to have some community representation. So at least one spot.
Okay.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, so that brings us through policy 840 and 840 Rule 1. So is there a motion to move on policy 840 and 840 Rule 1 to the full committee as amended, to the full board as amended, forgive me?
So moved.
All right, I will provide a second. There's a motion and a second on the floor. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All right, and I think Board Member Schneider had to step away, so that motion passes unanimously. So that brings us to policy 850, public solicitation promotion in the school. If everyone will give me a second, I will pull that up. All right, so let's just deal with the one page of policy 850. Board Member Anderson, do you have any edits?
I do not.
Okay. Ms. Kostropol, I see you have come to the podium. Do you have any context you would like for us to consider on policy 850?
Thank you, Board Member Levy. Not unless you have specific questions.
Okay, perfect. So what I actually had asked Dr. Kieser before the meeting started, that I will say for the benefit of the public, is actually the role of Chief of Communications and Marketing. And my question to him was it on his radar that that using chief may be considered as cultural appropriation? Of course, that's not something that we would edit through policy, but just for transparency, I would like for that to kind of be on the superintendent's radar, and you can make any proposals to the board that you deem fit. So for policy 850, Board Member Anderson, you didn't have any concerns with that. Let me pull up this note. Okay, so As Vice Chair Schneider had mentioned, we definitely want to be consistent with our policies. So my first note says that policy 852, distribution of non-school related materials to students. Okay, so let me back up. The first sentence in policy 850 says students, staff members, and the facilities of the schools shall not be used for advertising or promoting the interest of any community or non-school agency or organization except as otherwise provided. So my question is, do we need that sentence? Because we have a whole policy about how to do the thing that it says it won't be permitted unless it's basically an exception. Does that make sense? And I'm assuming as otherwise provided should be permitted. So to repeat, it's saying we're not going to do this thing unless you have an exception. That seems odd to me because we've dedicated an entire policy to explain how we do that. So again, policy 852, which we'll get to shortly, is for the distribution of non-school related materials to students. So it seems odd to open policy 850 by saying students, staff members, or the facilities of schools shall not be used for advertising or promoting the interest of any community or non-school agency or organization, except when we have a whole policy dedicated to how you do that very thing. So I would like to hear feedback, please. Board Member Anderson, go ahead.
Well, I mean, this could probably fix some of that confusion. Is there any way that we could possibly cross-reference 852? Because, I mean, maybe someone just like goes on board docs and looks up, oh, like I want to do this thing that involves solicitations at schools, and they're like, oh, like they don't realize that there is another policy that also outlines it. So.
No, let me try to describe it a different way. So my point is, if we open this policy by saying we will never allow students to eat blueberries, except, and then 3 policies later, it's how to enjoy blueberries in schools. That just seems awkward to me to say we won't do this unless you have an exception when there's a whole policy about how to do it. So what I would suggest is for public solicitation promotions in the school, and Attorney Barand, I'd like to hear your feedback going back and reflecting on that affirmative context that Attorney Love was going with. If we started with the following activities shall be discouraged, and then I kind of have issues with that, discouraged and or prohibited. Which is it? Is it's frowned upon or it's not allowed? But for the moment, if we start it with the following activities shall be either discouraged or prohibited, and we'll decide which one is most appropriate in the school district. And then we list them, and we omit that opening section, again, because we have a whole policy explaining how to do it. Is that problematic for anyone? Yeah, go ahead.
So, as I'm reflecting on the framing of this in the conversation, so typically schools are captive audiences, and that becomes a very key terminology that I use when I talk with building leaders, and so. The public may choose to look at schools and say, these are great opportunities to promote programs and promote opportunities to students or to families through students by using the schools. And so what we're saying in the opening phrase of this policy is to say that schools should not be used for that purpose. However, we do recognize that as a school district having strategic partnerships, with entities within the community, that there may be exceptions in which we would approve passing through and quote unquote advertising or promoting some interest with it that we as a school have vetted and been okay with. But as a whole, 850 is saying, don't look at the schools as a grounds for promotion and solicitation. It is, the default is no unless we say yes. And so that's maybe I agree with you on changing the stance to a more asset-based perspective, but that's the rationale and reasoning for 850 as it pertains to the later policy 852, if that helps.
It does, but in my estimation, what is written here is not captured in what you just described. So I would be comfortable with us, let me be clear, with you and Attorney Parand taking policy 850 offline a bit and capture what you just described to us. So one, acknowledging that schools are captive audiences and explain what that means in the educational and legal context. And then saying, because of this, we don't want X, Y, and Z entities to view our children or our learning environments as places to promote, solicit, et cetera. Now, with that being said, we will allow certain things. I think that's very different than than the way the language is currently crafted. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay. So we're going to take, unless another committee member objects, 850 offline, so superintendent can work with Attorney Barand and kind of craft the spirit of captive audience. Basically, don't use our babies or our facilities for whatever. But just a couple things that I want to point out as this is being worked on offline. For number one, announcements, posters, bulletins, and comparable communications, which do not relate to schools. Lots of words there, and then it says that can be approved by the superintendent or the chief communications of marketing. Now, later in policy, because we definitely want to be consistent, it gives, in policy 852 to be exact, it gives principals the authority to make those calls. So what I'm proposing is that we take policy 850 and 850 Rule 1 and also 852 offline. And as you rework the opening language of 850, really make sure that like the authority to grant permission is consistent. Because in this document, it's Ms. Christopoulos' role and it's the superintendent. But then if we jump down to policy 852, it's your role, the superintendent's role, and also principals. And there may be some variation of when it's okay for principals to approve. And I think there is some specificity about building level and not district level. But if we could just pull those three policies offline and one, rework the language at the beginning of 850, and then two, make sure that we are consistent with who can approve what. That would be helpful. Board Member Spencer, are you okay with tabling policies 850, 850 Rule 1? Yep, make sure I had that right. And then 852 until that consistency can be achieved. Do you have any objections to that?
I do not.
Okay. So unless there's anything else that you wanted to add for context as those are being worked with offline, we will move past 850, 850 Rule 1, and we will also bypass 2K, which is 852. Thank you in advance, Dr. Kieser and Attorney Barand. Those will come back for us in July with those adjustments that we just discussed. So that's going to move us to policy 851. Thank you, Ms. Christopoulos. Policy 851, advertising. So this one is 3 pages, so we'll take it page by page. Board Member Anderson, anything for policy 851 on that first page?
No.
Okay. So my question, that opening sentence says the school district of Beloit recognizes that revenue and in-kind benefits from advertising by non-district organizations and private schools is a viable means to help support the district operations, comma, it goes on. So I'm just wondering, Dr. Kieser, what agreements do we currently have in place? Just to provide context as we're reviewing this policy, like, oh, this is what it means in context of this agreement. Or Ms. Christopel, you feel free to jump in as well. So again, what agreements do we currently have in place that are in line with what's described in this opening sentence of policy 851?
Okay, and I will speak to the marketing and communications advertising. There's another policy with technology, but in this, we have no agreements right now
Okay.
for any advertising online or within our buildings.
Okay. So my question before we really dig into it, one, were you able to review this policy and provide feedback? And you did that kind of future thinking to like agreements you would like to establish or that would be best for the district. Is that accurate?
Yes, it is. Thank you, Board Member
Oh,
Lee.
perfect. All right. Board Member Anderson, I think I asked you, but just in case I didn't, anything for that first page?
No.
Okay. So my question, that second paragraph, actually three things. So the first and third thing, that doesn't make sense because you're not in my head. Let me walk you through it. The first sentence, the Board of Education shall have final authority regarding the interpretation of this policy. So my question is, that's accurate for all policies? So is it really, like, is there a point in stating that? And then my next point is the superintendent shall have the propriety of action covered by this policy taken by district employees. Again, that's true for all policies. It's the superintendent's job to execute the policy that's laid out by the board. So unless I'm missing something, is there a reason why that's explicitly stated in this policy?
Not to my knowledge, other than, as you mentioned, to just reiterate what is already established in other policies and in state law.
All right. Short and sweet. Thank you. So my other question that's kind of buried in those two clauses is and disputed advertising fees. Since we don't currently have any such agreements, Ms. Christopel, does it make sense, and Attorney Baran, to jump in and talk about fees specifically in this policy? I would say yes, but is it that it is not covered anywhere else in this policy and we need to have that clause there?
Board Member Levy, I do believe it is covered, but now I might be thinking that if there are disputes, it is brought with the Executive Director of Business Services. So
Can you point, I know it's a lot, and we have a lot on our plate tonight. Would you mind pointing out what page?
Yeah, I'm going to look at the third page.
Okay.
It's, second page of the district and school publications may contain advertising as determined by the administrator responsible, subject to approval by marketing, school principal. There will be a fee for advertising, which is to be approved by the executive director of business. So it's interesting to me that we don't interloop that earlier on, because that, I think, is the place to start, as the executive director of business services works with all contracts and
Right.
vendors. Just my suggestion.
So what I am now recommending, thank you, Ms. Christopel, is that we omit that second paragraph that starts with the Board of Education and ends with district employees. We take out that nugget about disputed advertising fees and go to page 3 where Ms. Christopel just directed us. So at that top, it's like the second point of a bullet point from page 2, but it's carried over into 3. So there will be a fee for advertising, which is to be approved by the Executive Director of Business Services. And then we end that with any disputed advertising fees. The Board of Education shall have final authority regarding any disputed advertising fees. I think that would be a more appropriate place to put that little bit of information. Does that make sense, Ms. Shope?
No, because I'm not exactly sure where you're putting it, and there are
No
several
problem.
places.
Okay, so let's do
Where-
this. Let's go to the top of page 3 that starts with school principals, parentheses, for school publications. And then it says, there will be a fee for advertising, which is to be approved by the Executive Director of Business Services. So that makes sense, Ms. Kostropol. That's in line with what you would envision this type of agreement being. And then we had a new sentence that said, the Board of Education shall have final authority regarding any disputed advertising fees. So that would be the last sentence at the top of page 3.
Board Member Levy, perhaps the confusion is that there are similar provisions in the next couple of bullet points on page 3. So perhaps the statement regarding fee disputes might be better served as a standalone provision earlier in the policy that would encompass all of those.
So what about this? If we, from the top of page 3, if it read, there will be a fee for advertising, which is to be approved by the Executive Director of Business Services, period, new sentence, the Board of Education shall have final authority regarding any disputed advertising fees. So those two sentences, we remove from page 3, and then that would replace paragraph 2 at the top of policy 851.
If I may,
Please.
if you go back to the rules governing district-related advertising, which
Is
is
that
right toward the beginning, and drop to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 6th paragraph, it reads, the amount of revenue charged and/or in-kind benefits to be received through such advertising and the terms of written agreements for such advertising are subject to approval by the Executive Director of Business Services. Would that be an appropriate place to add your sentence about the board having final authority regarding the disputed advertising fees, and takes it away from where all those other places are being specific about specific types of advertising?
That is wholly appropriate. So if you would then go ahead and omit that second paragraph. So starting with the Board of Education and ending with district employees. And then at the top of page 3, we can get rid of that last sentence. There will be a fee for advertising, that one. And then where you just directed us to, which is the top of page 2, the amount of revenue charged, we keep that the way it is, ending with approved by the Executive Director of Business Services, period, and then also include the following sentence. The Board of Education shall have final authority regarding any disputed advertising fees. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I just want to clarify that
Yeah.
where it's saying district and school publications may contain advertising, that's where you want me to eliminate the sentence about fee for advertising, which is to be approved by the executive director?
Yep, because it's all going to be included in that clause. There's no need to continue to repeat it.
Okay, because the next paragraph has that there's an advertising fee for distribution privileges. and
What page
then
are you on, please?
It's the paragraph right below the one that you told me to remove the sentence. There will be fee for advertising, which is approved. So the very next paragraph says printed programs that contain advertising may be distributed with or without charge.
Hold on. If you can give me a page number, that would be helpful, because we've moved that sentence around a bit.
Well, for me, it's page 2, but for you, you were saying this is at the top of page 3, so it'd be the very next paragraph, right before the
Printed programs, I'm with you.
printed programs.
Okay.
Yep, at the end of that paragraph, there's a sentence that says there'll be advertising fee for distribution privileges, which is to be approved by the Executive Director of Business Services.
Hold that thought. We're going to go back to page 2. Okay, Attorney Brand, is there a difference between advertising fees and advertising fees for distribution privileges. If we have advertising fee, that can be all encompassing of any type of fee related to advertising. We don't have to specify, correct?
I think that's true. I think the specificity here is to distinguish from the first 3 bullet points at the bottom of page 2 that say there is no fee for those specific types of advertising.
Okay.
So I believe it is there to distinguish from that.
Perfect. So if we can do that sentence that we just agreed upon, for me, it's at the top of page 2. So the amount of revenue charged, that paragraph. Do you see where that is?
Yes.
Then we will omit any reference to advertising fees in the rest of the policy, except where it's specifically saying where a fee is not charged. Does that make sense?
Yes, because the last 2 bullet points of the policy also have a statement saying there will be a fee. So I'll get rid of those 2.
Yep.
Okay.
So we're going to cover the fee once.
Okay.
And the executive director of business services approves it. The board has final say on any fee disputes. And then anywhere else it references a fee, omit, except, and if it's telling people there's no fee for this.
Perfect.
All right.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
That's where I was getting confused because I'm like, there's so many places it's saying it, so.
Yep.
But that makes perfect sense now. Thank you.
No problem. All right. We want to be streamlined. Back on page 1, excuse me, at the very bottom, the last paragraph for me, where it says advertising is prohibited in district classrooms, et cetera. If you go halfway through, it says principals are authorized to permit advertising at or related to their schools in accordance with the terms and conditions of this policy unless otherwise determined, and then it lists who determines it. When you are working on those other policies that we listed offline, if you can just make sure that we're consistent with that, then I think we're good. All right. If we go to the bottom of policy 851 at the cross-reference sections, it has remove policy 850 rule 1. And that I just put a question mark. Why? Because that is on slate to be revised. So am I missing something?
To me, that would be an appropriate cross-reference at this point. So I'm not entirely sure the notice for removal.
So just remove the word remove?
Yes.
Okay. And then we'll get to this next, but it's a cross-reference on this one. In keeping with nomenclature, it seems to me we should have policy 851, which we just got done discussing, and then the next one, instead of 850.1, should be 851 rule 1, unless there's something that I'm missing. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. This was done under a unique circumstance that goes back to when we were getting a contract for a new scoreboard. So I'll talk about that when we get there.
All right. Look forward to that. So
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I don't mean to interrupt. I'm confused. Am I supposed to be changing numbering somewhere, or?
So yes and no. Okay. So at the bottom of policy 851, the cross-reference section.
Yes.
The first thing is it says remove
Right.
850 rule 1. So
Yep, I got
we're going
that.
to keep it. So we're going to remove the word remove.
I got that.
And then the next thing is that unless there's something I'm missing, policy 851.1 should be named policy 851 rule 1. Is there a reason it's .1 instead of rule 1 for consistency?
Because it's a sub-policy. It's not a rule at the time that we created it, it wasn't considered a rule to the advertising. It was considered a new policy on advertising that would be like a sub-policy to the advertising. So it would become a .1 under 851, because 851 is like the category for advertising. So anything that has to do with advertising would be like 851, and then 851.1, 851.2, 851.3, and so on down the line. That's the way the numbering system works. If you were going to have a rule, it would be how you're going to carry out advertising in general. But this was a specific policy on technology advertising, like Dr. Keiser said with the scoreboard. So that's why it was developed. And so it's the numbering in the WASB numbering system that we use.
So the thing that's throwing me off is so what is currently named 851.1 is for guidelines for advertising through technology. So that for me seems like a how-to. And all of our other how-tos are rules. Dr. Keiser?
That you took the words right out of my mouth. Either we need to change the titling of, if we want to say advertising through technology, 851.1, we take off the word guidelines. If we want to leave the word guidelines in, then I would agree. Our new numbering system would put that into the rules.
Okay.
And I really don't care how you number it. I just was explaining why it was numbered the way it was. So
Yep,
you
I
tell me what
appreciate
you
the
want.
history.
We appreciate your historical knowledge and the fact that you don't care how it's numbered. Both important to consider. I would lean towards, since what is currently named 851.1 seems instructive, like how to, I would push to have that as 850. Thank you so much for coming. To have that listed as 851, Rule 1. Board Member Anderson, do you have thoughts on that?
I'm fine with doing the just kind of keeping it as you described.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Keiser, you're on board with Rule 1?
Yes.
All right. So we are going to change that to 851 Rule 1 in the cross-reference. And then that's a great segue to 851.1, which we are proposing be changed to 851 Rule 1, guidelines for advertising through technology. So that is a 2-pager. We'll take it one at a time. Board Member Anderson, any questions or edits on page 1?
I do not.
No? Okay. I have a couple. So in that first paragraph, the third line down, upon which advertising that promotes, if we could put an S there, promotes products or services to students, staff, parents. And then my question on paragraph 3, where it says all advertising agreements shall be in writing and shall, all of the words there. Do we have a current example of how this is currently in place?
So this rule was currently put in place with the scoreboard. There was a proposal of advertising for, I believe it was Coca-Cola, and so there was a cost borne by the advertising of Coca-Cola products, so that the scoreboard cost would not be borne solely on the district. And so that was the impetus for this. To Ms. Christopa's comment, at this time we don't have a ton. We do have some advertising through technology as far as fundraising. I do believe that at times Mr. Beard had some advertising on the website, but I do not know if there's anything current at this particular time.
Okay. So that kind of leads me to my next question, which if we go down from that third paragraph, it's the third item down. Inclusion of advertising does not constitute approval and/or endorsement of any product, service, organization, or activity. And I'm sure there's kind of like a legal definition and then a practical definition. So so two things with Coca-Cola. One is our advertisement commitment through the duration of the scoreboard. So like if Coca-Cola is on that scoreboard, is it physically on there and until the scoreboard is removed, we are advertising Coca-Cola? Is that accurate?
There was time limited, so there was like X number of years that we had an agreement with them, and so once that had expired, then no, we don't have to keep that on there.
Okay. And then my question, and again, I suspect there's like a legal answer and then there's a practical answer. So Attorney Baran, feel free to unmute and jump in. How can we realistically say we don't support Coca-Cola if they are physically visible? It's not like we're promoting it or shoving it on anyone, but how can those two things be true? So if it wasn't Coca-Cola, let's just say it was a horrible thing, right? And this horrible thing company said, we'll give you X amount of dollars if you allow us to appear on your scoreboard for the next 3 years. And we say, oh, that's a good deal for the district. And so now we have horrible thing on the scoreboard. How can we say we don't, let me go back to the language, approve of the endorsement of the product, service, organization, or the activity if it's visibly available for everyone to see?
And I was thinking through those permutations because on one level, yes, by accepting money for advertising in a digital space or a physical space, there is an implied approval that you're willing to have that be displayed on your property. But that is different than saying we are endorsing it to the point that we would allow them to put our name in their advertising. So it's not it's kind of a both and from my perspective. Yes, there is limited endorsement of it because we've accepted money for the advertising, but it's different than saying Coca-Cola, you can say in your advertising, the school district of Beloit endorses Coca-Cola as the best Coca-Cola out there on the market.
Okay. So, Attorney Baran, is it prudent to kind of explicitly state that with respect to cross promotion is not included? Because I think that would explain it better to people. Like, yes, we have Coca-Cola on our scoreboard, but that doesn't mean Coca-Cola can use the school district of Beloit in their advertisement as an endorser. So that kind of cross promotion. Or am I overthinking it? What's kind of the legal perspective of does not constitute approval or endorsement of any product, service, or organization?
I think you can spell that out. I don't know if that will limit your contracts in any way. I presume it would not, and you would intend it to do so if it did. I suspect that was put in there much in the same way that we talk about who you lease your space to,
Right.
not being an endorsement of everything they might happen to stand for, in the sense that you are allowing Coca-Cola to appear on your scoreboard, but the school district doesn't necessarily support everything that the CEO of Coca-Cola might go out and say, or every other organization they might be affiliated with, I expect was the intent. I don't think there's any legal harm in leaving it in there. From a practical perspective, I agree it has limitations.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. My next question is if we move down to the next section, that sentence ends with must be age appropriate for the students who may be involved. Just for context, legally, what does involved mean? Like be exposed to that advertising? Is that what is meant by be involved?
So because this is specific to technology, technology can be targeted towards either the entire population or it could be targeted to a particular group. And so that is why I believe that language was initially put in there because when you have technology, especially back in 2012, we didn't know all the things that we do know now about how technology can be targeted. So we wanted to make sure that we are being mindful of as many aspects of who's going to be seeing this advertising that we could at that time.
So should we change involved to targeted, or is there a reason that we're using the word involved?
I agree. Targeted might be a better term at this point.
Okay, are there any objections to that from committee members? All right, so if we change involved to targeted and knowing that's in reference to the advertisement, I think that would be more appropriate to the spirit of what's meant. Excuse me. If we go to the last page right after number 8, it says placement of commercial messages. I'm just not clear what constitutes a commercial message, so if someone could clarify that.
So similar to an advertisement, commercial message would just be message. I'm not finding the words tonight, but to me, like a commercial. So if a advertiser had a slogan or a message that they were promoting, it would be that type of a.
So is that like a 15-second, like an ad that you watch? So would it make more sense to say placement of commercial or other advertisements?
Sure.
Okay. And then if we move down to the next section, it says nothing in this policy shall be interpreted to prohibit or require authorization for public service announcements or events directly related to services of the school district of Beloit. I have no idea what that means.
Basically, it's carving out that public service announcements, things that are deemed public service announcements, or anything that is directly related to the school district of Beloit is outside of the purview of this policy. So we are able to not have to worry about this policy when it falls under those two narrow caveats.
So if someone is advertising on our website, and so they own tab 3 of our website, this says, if I'm understanding what you just said, if we need to make a public service announcement like district is closed or this change, even though they own the rights to tab 3 of our website, we can still use that for public service announcement purposes. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay, that makes sense. And then my final thing for this policy, where it says ads may not, and then number 1, automatically redirect a user to a different browser window prior to clicking on the ad. 1, I didn't know that was a thing. I didn't think you could just be automatically redirected without clicking. But since we did specify prior, is it okay if they redirect you after you click on the ad?
Right. This was at a time and a space when pop-up ads were all over the place. So it actually links to number 2. It's a form of malware where just by having this open up, there can be a little script that automatically opens up a new window and redirects you to a page. So
let me pause right there because I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. If a pop-up ad doesn't automatically redirect me, it automatically appears. And we have board member Winfield, who is our tech expert here, so I'm going to call you out and help me. A pop-up ad can't redirect me, but it can pop up without my permission. So 1, is that possible to automatically redirect someone to a different browser and I haven't clicked on anything? Board member Winfield, is that a thing?
You will have to engage that to go to another website.
Okay, so should we change this, or is the intention to say automatically redirect a user to a different browser window after clicking on an ad? Is that what we mean to say? Or after I like the language used, after engaging with an ad.
Right. So in this scenario, it doesn't hurt to be more specific. There was a time and a space where there was programs that were embedded within ads that would do all sorts of things within the computer, and hence why they developed things like the pop-up ad blockers and all those good things.
Right.
So, yes, I think we can be more specific in saying ads may not automatically redirect a user to another website without clicking on the ad. That's probably a little bit cleaner.
So my thing is, I don't think that's possible. The thing we're describing, I don't think has ever happened to any human on the planet, unless I'm misunderstanding this. So I have never been, to my knowledge, automatically redirected to a different browser without engaging with an ad. So clicking on it or swiping it or something like that. Board Member Winfield, dude. Am I describing my internet experience accurately?
Yeah, yes and no. So there's some ads out there that
Yes.
will pop up as a timer, and you don't see the timer, and it will be faded into the advertisement.
So if I don't say no
If you
before
don't
the
say
time
no
runs,
or yes before the times run out, it's going to automatically redirect you to that advertisement.
Well, you were being generous. The answer was just no. It wasn't yes and no.
Well, because I've seen some that just will stay there, and you can cancel it.
Okay.
With where the timer is at, it was so cancel, but it would be hard to see. It's like it blends in with the background.
So what if we, to be broad but still address this, ads may not redirect a user to a different browser without affirmative engagement?
Or without a click. I don't know if that's the verbiage you want to use, but we want to make it very clear that if you click on it, you're going to be took into another advertisement.
Okay. Attorney Barand, help us with the language, but do you kind of get where we want to go?
I think I do, but I'm not the technology expert either. Automatically redirect a user to a different browser window without their affirmative engagement or action.
Okay. Do we have a preference over engagement or action? I don't. Okay, so number one, we'll okay, so ads may not, number one, redirect a user to a different browser window without an affirmative action. Would that cover all our bases? Perfect.
By the user. Do you think you need by the user?
Yes,
Action by the
please. By the user. Do you need me to repeat that, Ms. Shope?
No, my only question is, are you keeping the word automatically at the beginning or not?
No, we're going to lose automatically.
Okay,
Yep,
thank you.
redirect. All right. Okay, so is there a motion to approve both policy 851 and the proposed name change for policy 851, Rule 1, to move on to the full board for a first reading?
So moved.
All right, I will provide a second. Is there any discussion? Okay, hearing none, all in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All right, any opposed? All right, that motion passes unanimously. So we are going to hold on policy 852. We will see that again at our July meeting. That brings us to our last policy for the evening, policy 853, political activities in schools. It's a one-pager. Board Member Schneider, do you have any questions or edits for policy 853?
I do not.
Okay. Board Member Anderson, same question.
I do not.
Okay. My only question is, the paragraph that begins, where discussions with students, that last sentence, it says, teachers are encouraged to have speakers from all sides of an issue speak. if they choose to use resource people to explain significant points of view to students. But when you couple that with the last statement, if I'm understanding it correctly, teachers cannot ask candidates to speak in their class. Is that correct? Because the next sentence says candidates for election, and it doesn't specify what type of election, but candidates for election will not be permitted to speak on campaign issues in class from the time nomination papers are taken out until after such election. So if we go back to that previous statement, if teachers choose to use resource people, one, they need to include people from both sides of the issue, but that cannot include a current candidate.
That is correct. So you could say we're going to have let's say it's a current events class, and so we're going to take a current event topic, and there's some political back and forth from the two different political parties. You can bring current people who are in their roles, but if it is during election time and that is a campaign topic, they cannot come in and talk about it at that time. That's basically how this is written up. So again, kind of that captive audience. Candidates are not allowed to campaign on school grounds.
Okay. Is discussing an issue considered campaigning? Because if I'm just discussing an issue and I'm not saying, oh, and by the way, vote for me because this is how I feel on this issue. And let me provide a bit more context. So when I was campaigning for the board, I was invited to speak at the Black History Month program as a distinguished speaker.
Yep.
So I spoke, and I talked to students about what's going on in schools, et cetera. So it wasn't necessarily I was there to speak on a campaign issue, but I could see how that could be perceived to be in violation of this policy. If you have a candidate to speak in a school and anyone is able to ask questions, a campaign topic, quote unquote, could come up. So is it our position that no candidates are allowed to speak in classes, period? Is that the intention of this policy?
The intent is to explicitly do campaigning during a campaign season. So to the example that you gave, the intent of you being there to speak was on Black History Month and issue, and as you were talking to individuals, issues of things going on in the school and so forth, you weren't there to talk about school reform or school board ethics and stuff. So this policy is to be give leeway and interpreted, say, I invited Dan Keyser to come in and talk about being a superintendent, so on and so forth, and the roles of being a superintendent. And if I was also, say, campaigning to be state superintendent at that time, I may be in violation of that. But if I was coming in to talk about the history of schools and how schools evolved to where they are today, and I also happen to be campaigning for state superintendent, that would make sense, and that I wouldn't necessarily be violating that because the intent of the topic was a history topic on education, not on state superintendencies and superintendency issues, if that makes sense.
So the thing that makes me, that gives me pause is it says candidates for election will not be permitted to speak on campaign issues. Could we have legal guidance on, because I would think anything could be considered a campaign issue. Am I reading that correctly, Attorney Barand, or is there a line drawn where candidates for election will not be permitted to campaign or solicit, instead of campaign, because that's kind of vague, candidates for election will not be permitted to solicit endorsements or support while speaking? What's the line there?
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me. I think campaign issues perhaps leaves room for interpretation. I agree with you that the listening support is more defined. In Dr. Keyser's example, at what point does the history of education influence
Right.
superintendency policy? That seems like that might be difficult for a member of the public to discern.
So is the spirit that if someone is a campaign for because it could be city council coming into the school. So let's use that. So if a person is a candidate for city council, is the spirit of this policy that yes, you can be used as what we are calling a resource person to talk about issues. That's fine, but you may not solicit endorsement or support during your visit as a speaker. Is that what we mean to say here?
I think we certainly could, if we want to define it that way, we certainly can. This is to try to carve out for our teachers who may be bringing in speakers to engage students in their education and also in civics. We want to have that dialogue and debate, but what we don't want is we don't want this to be, again, leveraging the students as a captive audience
Right.
for the benefits. So if we want to define it and say, hey, if you're a candidate for city council and you want to come in and talk about affordable housing, but as long as if the policy is to be read, you cannot solicit endorsement, please vote for me for city council. You can come in and talk about affordable housing. You might have a different perspective than the person standing next to you. But as long as both of you know that you cannot be saying, vote for me come election day, and we're okay with that, we're good.
Okay, so do we run into any legal issues if we constructed that last sentence to say candidates for election may be used as a resource person? So that kind of, it explains what a resource person is to come in and talk, et cetera. So that's already outlined prior to. So candidates for election may be used as a resource person, but may not solicit endorsement or support for their campaign.
I think that's fine. Obviously, to the extent that the school, is a limited public forum, you want to make sure you're uniform in how you're permitting individuals and especially candidates who are, by definition, on two different sides of an issue or at least a candidacy,
Right.
presenting to the school or to the classroom. So I believe you're still fine in how you've worded that, assuming that the candidate has a unique resource value to the classroom.
Right, so let me repeat, and then I'll yield the floor to our committee members. Candidates for election may be used as a resource person, but may not solicit endorsement or other support for their campaign. Vice Chair Schneider, are you comfortable with that? Do you have any edits?
Well, I guess the question I would have is that if the topic that they're talking about is affordable housing, and that is a campaign issue, somebody may say if a candidate comes in and talks about their point of view of affordable housing, that they are encouraging the students to look at their point of view, and even though they don't specifically solicit their vote, it then can be seen by others as they are convincing the students that he or she has the right decision as what should happen with affordable housing. I could see that could become more of a public awareness issue.
So is that neutralized by what comes before it. So teachers are encouraged to have speakers from all sides of an issue speak if they choose to use resource people to explain significant points of view to students. So it shouldn't be one person's perspective without that being challenged or critiqued by another perspective on any particular issue. So with those two things combined, are you still uncomfortable with having that? And if yes, which is completely fine, do you think we should leave it or change it to say candidates cannot be used as a resource person to avoid all of this? Thank you, Board Member Winfield.
I guess I'm okay with the changes as long as it's clear that the teachers have to make sure they have both points of view being presented in the classroom. So, yeah.
So would you be more comfortable with saying teachers are required to have speakers from all sides of an issue if they choose to use a resource person? Or I would love to hear an educational perspective. Is that putting an undue burden on teachers? Should we again, which is still on the table, just say to avoid any appearance of this, that candidates just aren't allowed to be used as resource persons?
So in the, I think it gets clarified where that paragraph above it, as you mentioned, as part of instructional programs, teachers must include consideration of both sides as it affords to the opportunities. So we believe strongly in that schools are a place for free thought, and so the expectation is that you can't just bring one perspective to the table, you have to bring multiple perspectives. So that includes resources. In human resource terms, you can't just say, well, I'm going to give you this article about one side of the issue, but I'm going to bring in a speaker from the other side of the issue. If you're going to do people as a resource, you got to provide both sides of the issue in the same medium in which you are providing those resources.
Okay. Board Member Schneider, does that adjust your preference for the language of this policy, hearing that context from Dr. Kieser?
It does.
Okay. All right. Board Member Anderson, what are your thoughts on this?
No, I think if we're going to use candidates, that you definitely want to bring in both sides, because again, it can be depending on like what direction that, like if what they're running for, they might have a different point of view on some things compared to others. But I mean, and if you use this example of city council, well, there's other people that are currently seated that aren't up for election. So, I mean, you always have that option too.
Okay. So in summary, are we comfortable with keeping the policy as is, except for that last sentence, saying candidates for election may be used as a resource person, however, they may not solicit endorsement or support for their campaign? I feel like I need to finish that. Board Member or Vice Chair Schneider, please go ahead.
I am comfortable with that change.
Okay. That kind of felt unfinished. Let me read through it again. So candidates for election may be used as a resource person, period. However, they may not seek endorsement or support for their campaign, period. Any objections to that language?
No.
All right, so is there a motion to approve policy 853 as amended to move on to the full board for a first reading?
So moved.
Second.
All right, there's a motion and a second on the floor. Is there any discussion, any further discussion, I should say? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All right, that motion passes unanimously. Just to recap, we are holding over policy 852. And also, correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Shope, did we say policy 850 and 850 rule 1? Yep, okay. Thank you so much. So everything on our slate has been approved to move on to the full board for first reading, except items 2G, H, and K. All right. So that brings us to next meeting. The next policy meeting will be Wednesday, July 6th at 5:30 at the Colac Education Center. There's plenty of room in case anyone would like to join us. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All right, there's a motion and a second for adjournment. Any discussion? All in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All right, that motion passes unanimously. Attorney Baran, thank you so much. All right, take care, everyone.